I follow the 14th, so what you see here is what you get. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. This chapter is a really fun chapter because it helps us to understand a lot of the underpinnings of conflict, which we all engage in. And so if we take a look at conflict from a communication studies lens, what we're focusing on is what leads to conflict in the communication process, and what are the ways we can use communication to manage that conflict, not necessarily always fix or find a solution to, but at least manage the conflict in a productive and positive way between two individuals or more. And so we start off, as we always do, with defining what conflict is. We can't start without understanding what is it that we are studying. And so the first thing that we're going to look at, what is conflict, and why do we care about it? And so conflict, as you can see here in my definition, is an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from the other party in achieving their goals. And so what that refers to, as you can see that I've colored certain words so that you can focus on them and understand the definition of conflict more in depth. And so the first sentence I want to cover in that is that it's an expressed struggle, meaning that it has to be expressed in some form of communication, whether it's nonverbal or verbal. One example of that is if you are really upset at a friend, but you never communicate that to them and you try to hide it in your nonverbal behaviors, and so they never know that you're upset at them. From a communication studies perspective, you don't have a conflict because the other person has not seen your expression of your conflict. But let's say you do try to still hide the conflict, you don't talk about it verbally, but the friend can tell through your nonverbal communication that you're upset at them or that you're uncomfortable in some way. And so that does count as conflict because you're expressing your struggle whether or not you intend to. The second line, between two interdependent parties, that is a throwback to our very earlier chapters, in chapters 1 and 3, when we learned about the self, when we learned about self-disclosure, when we learned about interdependency, meaning that we don't just create relationships with anyone, we create relationships with people with whom we have interdependence with. So we need them for something. We have them for something. So if it's an intimate friend, a really good friend, a best friend, you have them in your life because you enjoy their company, because you value them as a person. Most likely you two self-disclose a lot to one another, you feel trust with one another, and that's why you're in that relationship with that person. Another example of interdependence can be when you're at work and you might not want to be friends with your coworker, but you are definitely interdependent with them because you need them to complete your task, and you have to, generally have very positive relationships with your coworkers in order to be successful at your job. And so that's a key point of conflict. You don't necessarily have conflict with a random stranger, at Target that you got into an argument with once. That's an argument, but not a conflict. Is that clear? You and that stranger are going to part ways, and you'll most likely never see each other again. And so we don't consider that conflict. The next level, who perceive, in blue, you can see the word perceive, meaning that, going back to chapter 4, it's all about how we have decided to run all the data we're looking at, this external data, through the perception process. What if we decided to select? What if we decided to organize? All of that. And perceiving here also refers to the idea that it is quite possible that there is no need for conflict, that all your goals are resources, and there's no interference from the other in achieving your goals. You might just perceive or feel like the other person is causing some sort of discomfort to you, and it might not be actually true. And so that word perceive there is quite important. The next one is incompatible goals, meaning that your goals just don't mesh well. What you want is not what the other person wants. Scarce resources, this can refer to material resources like your money, car, home, whatever the case may be. It can also refer to immaterial resources, things like emotions, time, all of that. So if I feel like, for example, my romantic partner is spending more time at their work and not spending as much time with me, I might be needing the resource of time and shared emotions, and then, having depth to that relationship. That might be a resource that I want, that they are instead giving to their work instead of me. That's just one example. The last one is interference in red. Interference meaning that you are trying to accomplish some sort of goal, you're trying to get to something, you're trying to gain some sort of resource, but the other person is stopping you from doing it. Again, the blue word perceive prefaces this because they might not actually actively be trying to stop you from achieving your goals or accessing resources, but the fact that you perceive that is important, okay? When you get a chance, watch these 2 videos on interpersonal conflict in the workplace. They're great examples. So as we've talked about here, I want to tease out the definition of conflict a little bit more. And I want to stop at this slide to let you know that I have 2 awesome videos right here that I think are very useful in understanding a lot of the reasons for why we engage in conflict, how we typically engage in conflict, and what can happen as a result. So in this clip, I really encourage you to watch it. This video is not, I will make sure to change that. Does this one also do that? This one also does that. I will change this. Don't worry about that. But in both of these videos, we have clips from a show called Louis C.K. And in these clips, he has 2 different conflicts, one with his children and one with his ex-wife, who he's now obviously separated from, but he has to still talk to and communicate with actively because he shares custody of their 2 children. And so in both of those videos, he fights with his children on whether or not they perceive the same goals as him. He sees them as interfering with his goal, which is to keep them safe. And so in one of the videos, his child actually thinks she's in a dream, and she gets off of the train while he's in New York on a train trying to take her back to her mother's. She purposefully steps off the train and says, "This is all part of my dream." And she very much is a child that lives in a fantasy world, and he yells at her. He grabs her when he finds her again and shakes her. She starts crying, and he says, "You should cry because this is a very scary world." And it's just a very interesting video to watch because you can see there that the father really just wants to keep his child safe, but because she likes to play pretend and is in this fantasy world, she's obviously interrupting his goal or stopping his goal of keeping his daughter safe. The other conversation that he has is with his wife, or his ex-wife, where they're deciding whether or not to put their kids in private school or public school. And I really like how quickly the conflict devolves not just into a conversation about, okay, what should we do with our kids? Do our kids do this? Do they do that? What school is best for them? The conflict really becomes about them as people. What is it that they do to one another and say to one another to escalate the conflict? And so you'll notice that in that video, when I repost it, that Louis C.K. talks about, you only want to send your child to private school because that's exactly, what you want to show off to the rest of the world, right? He says you want to go to Whole Foods and show off about how your child has a crest on their shoulder. And so you can really see communicatively how the 2 parents, instead of talking about the children, end up talking about themselves. And so it's really about that interdependence that I talked about in the first definition. And so now that we've talked about the definitions of conflict, let's now look at different conflict styles. And one of the cool things about this is that as you're reading this, and also as you're doing your online activities, you might develop an understanding of what is my conflict style, what's my go-to. And I want to preface this by saying that a lot of us have like our go-to way of dealing with conflict. This is based off our personality, also based off our culture, based off of pretty much everything that we've learned in chapters 2 and 3 on culture and the self, as well as our perceptions of the world that we learned in chapter 4. We kind of tend to lean towards one way or the other when it comes to conflict styles. None of these conflict styles are inherently right or wrong. What you should focus on as a communicator is when is the right style effective and appropriate for me as a competent communicator. Remember in chapter 1, we learned about effectiveness and appropriateness. And that's really what we're focusing on here in this section of the chapter. In what ways can I select the conflict style that is most appropriate for what's going on right now in this given conflict, in this given situation. And so the first conflict style we are going to cover is avoidance, which is lose-lose. So both parties in the conflict decide to just step out of the conflict and they avoid one another. Typically what happens is that because you are ignoring one another or staying away from the conflict, you both build up a very pessimistic or negative attitude about the conflict, especially because you're away from each other and you're not talking about it. It's easy to kind of get in your own head and think and develop more thoughts about the conflict rather than just, what would happen if you talked about it face to face. And ultimately, a lot of people do this because it's easier to put up with the status quo. You'll find that, for example, couples who are fighting about the number one thing that couples fight about, which is finances, they tend to default to avoidance. They don't want to talk about finance. They will wiggle around it as much as possible. And that's because it's easier or less scary to just put up with the way things are right now than seriously sit down and discuss the very uncomfortable topic of finances, right? And who's responsible for what and how much each person contributes and all of that. And because it's a practice of just putting up with the status quo, putting up with how things are right now and not wanting them to change, that typically leads to our last bullet point, which is that you get unsatisfying relationships. You get people who don't feel that their relationship is growing in any direction because, of course, it's not growing in any direction. If you're consistently using lose-lose, you're avoiding conflict, you're not talking about it, so you're not growing as people together, whether you're friends or romantic partners or coworkers. And so you typically end up with people that just don't feel that their relationship with the other person is satisfactory or enjoyable. Avoidance, however, does have its benefits. Like I said, no style here is inherently right or wrong. It's really about what is appropriate in the given context. And so avoidance definitely helps when the risk of speaking up is too great in a lot of contexts. For example, work. You don't always want to bring up conflicts, especially if you're having one with your superior who might, use that against you in some sort of way. That's just one example, but sometimes there's a lot of risk of saying something or bringing up a conflict, right? It also can be helpful when the relationship isn't worth the effort. So, for example, if you are in class for a semester and you're in a group project and you're not really happy with one of your group members, one of your fellow students in the class that's in your group with you, you might not actually bring up the conflict. You might just be like, ugh, whatever, put it aside, not talk about the conflict, put up with the status quo. And you might do all of that because the relationship isn't worth the effort to you. You don't really care too much about that person. You're not looking to be their friend. You're not looking to, hang out with them any more than you need to complete this group project. And so for you, it just might not be worth it to bring it up. You might not even care about that person very much. You also find that people tend to avoid when the issue is temporary, meaning that you don't expect it to show up again or to become a very serious, long-standing problem. So if you're in a romantic relationship and you ever just get a little bit irritated at your significant other for something that that isn't a super big deal and that I love them for all these other great things and they just do this one thing that irritates me, you might choose avoidance and not express how much they irritate you just because for you, it's a temporary issue. It's something that'll pass. It's something that you won't be angry about for a very long time. And so you might choose avoidance in that situation as well. And so the next conflict style is accommodation, which is lose-win. This is when we accommodate or we let the other person or people get what they want out of the conflict. And so we pretty much give it up to them, like whatever it is that they want, whatever it is that they desire out of the end of the conflict, we give it to them. And I know that this seems very that doesn't seem very fair to ourselves to do that, but there's a multitude of reasons for why. And the biggest reason is that it enhances the relationship. All of us have to make sacrifices, and all of us, I think, engage in accommodation more than we recognize that we do. And we do this because inherently we're aware that if I give up this for this person, or if I let them win this conflict, or if I let them have their way, it's also a way to communicate that I care about them more than I care about this conflict. And so oftentimes you'll see very close friends, romantic partners, family members practice accommodation with one another because they want to enhance the relationship. They want to communicate to the other person, okay, look, we're having a conflict. I don't agree with you, but I'm going to do what you want because I want to show you how much I care about you. And so we also find that this crosses very well with culture. As we talked about in chapter 2, we talked about high versus low context cultures. High context cultures, such as Asian cultures, some Middle Eastern cultures, Latino cultures, some Latino cultures, see avoidance and accommodation as face-saving and noble, meaning that if you take the time to accommodate another person, because high context cultures also tend to be collectivist, meaning for the group and not for the individual, they see accommodation as something that is very preferable, that is noble, that is the right thing to do. Whereas low context cultures, such as us here in the United States, we view avoidance and accommodation far less positively. Because we're also low context and individualist, we like to verbally express our conflict, and we also like to express our conflict because of our individualist mentality, meaning that we focus on ourselves and what we want as individuals. And so because of that, we don't really like to use avoidance and accommodation, and if we do, we see it in a more negative light, whereas high context cultures see it as more noble or the right thing to do. All right, moving right along. The next one is competition. And so competition is always an interesting one because I think that it just says so much about how healthy a relationship can be when competition is present. And I know that sounds a little contradictory, but let me explain a little bit more. And so what the competition style is essentially win-lose. For there to be a winner, technically speaking, there has to be a loser, right? And so in this style of conflict, what we see ultimately is that each person has a high concern for their self and a low concern for the other person. I can't be caring about you if I also want to beat you at something, right? And it tends to be a big part of North American culture. We see this also in our sports culture as well. We really are very competitive in that nature. But the awesome thing about competition is that it really can help develop relationships when it's healthy, productive competition. And so first, to help clarify that, I am going to define what not healthy competition looks like, and then I'll talk a little bit about what healthy competition looks like. And so not healthy competition can include this pink word right here, passive aggression, which you've all heard about, which you've probably all been a victim to. This is when a communicator expresses their dissatisfaction, that they're upset with something, but in a disguised manner. So they might use sarcasm, they might use nonverbal behavior, they might use a combination of both. And ultimately what it is that it's supposed to drive the other person nuts, right? It's supposed to drive them a little crazy. It's supposed to irritate the other person. And ultimately what it does is that it communicates, hey, I'm upset with you, or I don't like you, or whatever the case may be, but I'm not going to tell you directly, right? There's no direct verbal confrontation. And so what it's really meant to do is spark guilt in the other person. Sometimes people who engage in passive aggression do so because they want the other person to feel some sort of guilt or to feel kind of bad for what is the perceived, conflict may be. Some nonverbal expressions might be eye rolling, loud sigh, just lots of extra facial expressions, of course, humor and sarcasm. But you've all been victims of passive aggression. You might have engaged in passive aggression, but we understand from a communication standpoint, it's a way for people to express how dissatisfied or upset they are without direct confrontation, because sometimes direct confrontation is a little uncomfortable for people. And so the second type is the complete opposite. So unlike passive aggression, direct aggression is literally very direct, involves a lot of confrontation. it usually involves a lot of verbal abuse and attacking of the other person. And ultimately, it has a very severe impact on the target as a result. You end up with someone who becomes a victim of verbal and nonverbal abuse. And so it ends up having a lot of course, harmful psychological effects to the victim, and ultimately destroys the relationship as a whole most of the time. And so these are two examples of just not productive conflict. And why are they not good? The thing that they are lacking is clear, what I call rules, or clear understanding of the way the conflict will play out and the way the competition will play out. So the best metaphor I can give you is this. Imagine you are playing a basketball game, and in any given official basketball game, there will be rules, correct? And so you could get incredibly competitive with one other person or one other player, one other team, one other person on the team, but it's healthy competition because in that context, in that environment, everybody understands the rules of the game. They understand what you can do in basketball, what you can't do in basketball. So the competition becomes contained, and it becomes focused on just making sure that you play well so that you can beat the other team, instead of these two types of conflict where imagine basketball and just take all the rules out of it and anyone can do whatever they want, right? That would be much more chaotic. That would be unhealthy competition because you'll end up with people who cheat or who maybe purposefully hit other people or bump into other people or hurt them, or essentially just engage in behaviors that are not conducive to healthy, productive competition. And competition can be a great thing because when you are in competition, what that does when it's healthy and productive and there's rules in place is that it helps you be at your best because you are up against someone else who you know is going to be at their best. And so how it can enhance relationships is that you could have a very fierce competition with someone else, but come to love and respect them for how hard they work and appreciate them for how hard they make you work, right, for the win. And so competition can be so helpful and so productive as a means of conflict resolution only if there are rules, boundaries, clear expectations in place. One other example in the real world where competition is healthy and not unhealthy. In the workplace, sometimes what we see is, big companies might do like company retreats where they get all their employees and take them to the woods to go camping or, wherever the case may be. And they have different games where they let their coworkers play against each other or compete for project ideas or whatever the case may be. And if management, right, the supervisors, the bosses, set up the rules fairly so everyone can participate, you usually end up with a company culture where people are much more tight-knit, they're much closer, they trust each other more. When you get a company, for example, that introduces competition into their workspace. So for example, if I'm your boss, I might say, okay, I will give 100 points of extra credit to any student who writes me a paper about why they love communication studies. If I did it fairly and set up competition in a healthy way, I would have a rubric. I would make sure that I would grade every single student based off that same rubric so that the student who is awarded the win, right, of the 100 points would feel good about their win, and all the people that didn't win would also feel good because they're like, hey, I tried, the rules were clear, Miss Win selected someone fairly. But what if, for example, I gave that same competition, but I decided, you know what, I really think I like Savannah the best, and so I'm just going to give it to Savannah because she's my favorite student. And so if that happens, then what you'll see is that other students like Vanessa, Sydney, Guillermo, Christopher will be like, wait, what? Like, well, I don't understand, because I won't have a rubric. I won't communicate to everyone, hey, this is how I picked my winner, and they'll clearly see that I just picked Savannah, because I prefer her. She's getting some sort of preferential treatment. And so what happens then is that Vanessa, Sydney, Guillermo, Christopher will all resent and dislike Savannah, and their relationships will actually start to deteriorate maybe instead of being enhanced and getting stronger. So again, clear rules, clear transparency in the conflict is always important if you are engaging in conflict. All right, so that was competition, win-lose, and now let's talk about compromise, which is lose-lose. And the difference between this lose-lose and avoidance, which is also categorized as lose-lose, is that compromise is a negotiated lose-lose. What that means is that the two parties involved got together, started talking, and they were like, okay, you give up that, I give up this. Boom, we're done. And so both parties lose in that situation because they both opted and chose to give up something in order to move forward in the conflict. And we, I think, as a society, promote conflict a lot. We say like, oh yes, conflict's a great thing. Let's do it. Let's compromise. And you hear people say that a lot in, I think, everyday conversation where they say things like, let's compromise with one another. Let's see what we can do. And compromise, I don't think should get that high seat, that, well, like people put it up on a pedestal and think it's like the best way to address a conflict. And it is a way to address it, but it is definitely not the best. But why would we engage in a negotiated lose-lose? Why would we both decide to give up something? Similar with avoidance, it helps both parties get a little bit something of what they want, a little bit of satisfaction. And ultimately, it still communicates, hey, I care about you, and I'm going to give up this thing for you, but I also want to express my needs, and I need you to give up this thing for me. And so it's this very interesting kind of back and forth that you'll get between two people or two parties that are in conflict. And there can be very high costs to it. So if a person has to give up their values, that's not good, right? But some compromises do leave parties satisfied. Why is that? And I have noticed, for example, that compromise can be incredibly appropriate, effective, and helpful when you are engaging in a conflict that, one, is very complex, 2 is very long, and 3 has exhausted the parties. So if you've ever been in a conflict where you fought with someone for an extended period of time, so not just like an hour, think days, like you and this person have been in conflict for days, and that every single time you talk about the conflict, it gets a little worse and worse, right? Or it escalates, or you have other things that you start getting mad about that, you almost start to forget what was the original thing that we were fighting about. When fights are that complex and difficult and long, I find that compromise is very helpful because it kind of is a nice little band-aid on wounds where it lets the other person know, hey, I know we haven't really gotten anywhere. We haven't found a resolution to our problem. We haven't really moved forward in our conflict, but I would like to, engage in compromise where we both share with each other, hey, I still care about you by both giving up something for one another. And so that's where compromise can be very helpful in that it can be this nice metaphorical band-aid of we've been fighting a while, let's kind of, let ourselves heal for a little bit before we move on. But ultimately, I don't think compromise should be the end-all be-all solution to your conflict. You should really not aim to have compromise be your ultimate go-to solution, because when you are just left giving up something for the other person, ultimately, you haven't really found a solution or resolution to your problem. You may have just, again, like I said, band-aided it, but maybe not fully healed, right? And so compromise is a great tool to help us move the conflict process along, but don't ever step into a conflict thinking I should aim for compromise from the get-go. It shouldn't be kind of like the holy grail of all conflict styles. The holy grail of all conflict styles should be collaboration. This is the win-win. And I would say that most of the time we don't actually achieve win-win as much as we want. I think if anything, we tend to avoid conflict when we can, and then if we have to, we will try to use compromise, competition, or some other style. And collaboration is very, very difficult. It is ideal. You do want to collaborate with others, but it's incredibly hard to do that. Why? Because win-win solutions, collaboration, is meant to satisfy or make happy everybody involved. And y'all should know by now, it's a little difficult to make everybody happy all the time, right? And so we find that this solution isn't always realistic in a lot of situations, because maybe you might be happy with certain things, but the other person isn't. And it's kind of hard to find that overlap where both of you are satisfied and happy with the solution to the conflict at hand. And so if you do it successfully, though, unlike conflict where you have a high concern for yourself and a low concern for others, here in collaboration, you try to balance both. You have a high concern for yourself and a high concern for other people. And so the whole mentality is we, not me, right? So it's not just what I want, but what is the best way to solve this problem for us, right? For our needs, what we want. And so it's a little bit of a hard mentality to get into if you're not close to the other person or if you're not invested in the relationship, right? This is definitely not a style you should use with someone that you don't know well or that you don't care about, or with whom you don't person that you don't trust in the relationship. Collaboration is definitely for people, for example, coworkers that have worked together for a decent amount of time and trust one another and have had successes together. Romantic partners, family members. Collaboration is kind of appropriate for those contexts because you care about those relationships, right? But again, remember that this type of problem solving is very rare and not always possible or appropriate. So we definitely put it up on this high pedestal, but just know that if you are trying to get to it, don't worry if you're getting frustrated because it's very difficult. And so 2 video examples that I also have for you here that I want you to watch. One is from the show Rules of Engagement. Up here, it's an example of compromise. Here is an example of the clip from A Beautiful Mind. The Beautiful Mind is a movie about a great mathematician named Dr. Nash, and it follows his life. And this clip is from an early part of his life when he is studying in college, and he's at a bar with his friends, and some very beautiful girl comes in, and so all the friends start fighting, right? They start engaging in competition conflict to see who gets to ask her out, who gets a chance to go on a date with this girl. And so he finds a collaborative win-win solution for all of them to where they all get to ask a pretty girl out and they don't get in each other's way while doing that. And so it's a really good example of what win-win does look like in real life. And so now that you have looked over the conflict styles, I think it's also good to look at what is my conflict style in relationship to the people around me that I care about, because it's very likely that your go-to conflict style isn't necessarily the go-to conflict style of your romantic partner or of other people around you that you care about. And so what we need to wonder and focus on when we are engaging with others is, do I have a complementary conflict style with them or a symmetrical conflict style with them? What that means is I'm looking to see if I complement, meaning that we have different behaviors, but they mutually reinforce, or they complement, or they fill in for each other. So, for example, if you are someone who's a lot on avoidance, and someone who's really tends to like competition, you have a complementary conflict style where if that person likes competition and winning and you just like avoiding, that makes sense because you'll avoid the conflict, so you'll by default lose, they will win, all of that kind of stuff. So it's different conflict styles but complement one another. Symmetrical conflict style is when people use the same tactics. So this is when both of you decide to avoid or both of you decide to engage in conflict, which also can be productive and positive. But it's good to know with the people that are very close to you or that you interact with a lot on a regular basis, what is their conflict style, what is mine? And so you have that knowledge in the back of your mind when you are engaging in conflict with them, because the likelihood of you having conflict with people that you see all the time is very high. We all engage in conflict even with the people that we love the most, right? Sometimes especially with people we love the most. And so there's two types of spirals that can come out of that when these two either complementary or symmetrical conflict styles are not kept in balance. Escalatory spirals are when partners treat each other with just lots of hostility. They escalate the conflict. So one person says something really mean and the other person has to say something just as mean or even more mean, right, to kind of counter back. So you get this very escalating spiral of just insults and hostility and animosity and verbal abuse. In a de-escalatory spiral, this is when both parties start to kind of withdraw from one another, step out away from each other, and ultimately what this leads is an overextended avoidance, right? So you get a lot of avoidance in this situation where they just don't interact with each other about the conflict, and so then they don't face their problems. And so these are different ends of the spectrum. So the escalatory spiral is they're engaging a lot and it's very negative and very abusive and hostile. And the de-escalatory, it's we're just gonna step back and really not talk to each other for a very long time and therefore not face our problems. So you can see here in this scene, two people who are in a relationship in this movie scene are fighting. And you can see how they start to escalate and then de-escalate within the scene itself. So the last kind of set of ideas of conflicts that we're going to cover today, now that we've looked at the definition of conflict, we've looked at the styles, let's kind of look at what really bad conflict looks like, right? And it's important to identify it so that we don't engage in it. And so there are what we refer to as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. This is criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. And so I really encourage you to watch this very nice explanatory video of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And this title of this idea of toxic conflict was done by Dr. Gottman, who is a researcher, and he kind of identified that there are these kind of 4, there is a little fly on my hair, oh my god. There are these 4 horsemen or 4 signs of very toxic conflict, and theoretically, if all 4 of these signs are present in any given relationship on a regular basis, we can predict that the relationship will terminate or end. And so the first one is criticism. This is when you attack the person's character. You say things like, you're selfish, or you're lazy. Why don't you just, do more work, or go to school, or da-da-da, or help me with the kids, or whatever the case may be, those kind of comments. Defensiveness is protecting yourself by denying responsibility. So this is when you decide, you know what, it's not my fault, it's your fault because XYZ, right? So you kind of deflect that responsibility onto the other person, and you decide to not take any responsibility for the conflict or the situation at hand. The third one is contempt, which is when you belittle and demean the other person. I want to clarify that this is different from criticism. Because criticism is when you are attacking the person's character and you're just critiquing. You're saying like, you're just not very helpful around the house. You're a little lazy. You don't help me do the dishes. Those kind of comments. Contempt is when you start saying things like, I don't even know why I'm with you. You're not worth my time. I don't even understand why people like you. So it's kind of when you take comments away from just the criticism angle and you give that person this kind of demeaning, you look at them almost as less than a human being with the comments that you're making on them. So contempt is much more deep than criticism. I would say that we actually all engage in criticism pretty often with people that we are in close relationships with. We should definitely try to avoid it, but it is kind of this nature of ours when we are angry at the other person, when we're in conflict with them, that we criticize them, right? We pick out the things we don't like about them. Please note that that's very different from contempt. Contempt is when you treat them as less than a human being, when you just belittle them, right? You take them down a notch, and you don't see their worth or value. The last one is stonewalling, and I want to clarify because a lot of students tend to think that this is the same as avoiding conflict, and it's not. So in avoidance style, the lose-lose style, both parties avoid talking about the conflict, but they still will possibly interact with one another, if that makes sense. So I might not talk to you about, for example, finances, because I don't want to talk to you about finances, but we can definitely interact and talk about other things, right? Stonewalling is avoiding one another by completely shutting down. So there is no interaction at all. There is no nonverbal or verbal interaction whatsoever. And usually stonewalling occurs when one person steps out of the situation and they decide to just not talk to the other person anymore. You see this a lot in relationships where one person gets upset at the other and then they just decide, I'm not going to talk to this person anymore. And they exit almost the relationship, and the other person is like, oh, I guess we're not talking anymore. And so that's typically what happens, where you put up a wall between you and the other person and you just decide, I'm not going to interact with you anymore. And so, again, if all of these 4 horsemen are present, we tend to have terminated or very unhealthy relationships as a result. The biggest predictor of a relationship ending is number 3, contempt. So all of the other 3 can be present, and theoretically, you can come back from it. But we find that once contempt gets thrown into the mix, it's a little bit harder to save, right, or salvage the relationship. Ultimately, what we get are people that engage in what you see there in the teal, the conflict rituals. And so you see this probably at a more heightened level with romantic partners because they're with each other a lot, but you'll also see it with your friends and your family, where you engage in conflict rituals or just repeated behaviors with one another. So if you ever think like, ugh, every time I fight with Sarah, we first scream at each other a lot, and then we don't talk for 3 days, and then we talk a little bit, and then we pretend it didn't happen. And that happens all the time. So if you kind of think of someone where every time I fight with this person, it plays out the same way, that's also called a conflict ritual. It's where you kind of have these repeated patterns of interlocking behavior, where whenever you and that particular person get together, it mixes into this very specific cookie cutter, predictable result that comes out of it. And so one of the things about this is that rituals are natural. They happen, especially with couples that have been together for a very long time, or friends that have known each other forever, or family members. It's very common to see people engage in conflict rituals all the time because they know each other so much, they've been around each other so much, they've fought so much, that of course it would make sense that they start to have patterns, right, of the way they approach their conflict. But the only time it's a problem is when it's the only way you know how to handle conflict. So if the only way you know how to handle conflict is by just avoiding each other, that can't work, right? It's healthy to know that both of you can explore different conflict styles and practice different conflict styles in any given situation, because, as a relationship grows, whether it's a friendship, romantic relationship, family member, things change, times change, right? You fight about different things, you become different people. And so as a result, your rituals have to shift and change a little bit. You can't keep using the same conflict styles that you've been using, right? So you have to be able to learn other ways to handle that conflict. Your ritual cannot be the only way that you do it. And so we also see that conflict, as always, we have to study the different ways that it varies among gender and culture. What we find is that gender does play a role in the way people engage in conflict. There are some small yet measurable gender differences. For example, males tend to use more competing behaviors with other males, and they tend to avoid with females. Women tend to be more focused on maintaining the relationship, so that becomes their goal, not actually what you're fighting about. So for men, let's say that John and James are friends, and John and James had lunch, planned to have lunch together, and James forgot and accidentally stood John up. Theoretically, and I'm saying theoretically, using this gender research, John and James would fight about being stood up, right? Hey, don't do that again. And then that would kind of be that. Whereas with women, if it were 2 women, we find that the women involved would be more focused on not just the getting stood up, but also the emotional and relationship impact of getting stood up, of the relational impact of the conflict. So there's a difference between fighting about the conflict itself and the emotional relationship impact of the conflict, right? Because, for example, we can find a solution to a conflict, but it might change our relationship with that person after the conflict is said and done. And so males tend to focus on the goal of the conflict, which is like to resolve the conflict, find a solution. Females tend to focus on how can I preserve or keep safe or keep good the relationship as I'm working through the conflict. Again, these are generalities. Studies overwhelmingly find, as you can see here, that the individual style of each communicator is more important than gender. So while gender comes into play, ultimately what we find is your individual personality, your conflict style choices, all of that play far more into how you will deal with a conflict than your gender will. As we've talked about a little bit earlier in this slide we talked about this in avoidance and accommodation. The ways in which people resolve conflicts vary from culture to culture. We find that cultures, depending on what they value, as we learned in chapter 2, they will look at disagreement, face management, preserving face in different ways. Like I said, individualistic cultures prefer competing, collectivistic cultures prefer compromising and problem solving, and it makes sense, right? So you can kind of look at these different styles and see what would someone who's individualist, low context like to do. They would, of course, like the style that is more competitive, that is more focused on the self, than having concern for others. And they definitely would also be more verbal because they're low context. And so we would find that certain styles obviously match with that cultural value. Okay. So, how do we manage conflict? Like I said earlier in this lecture, it's not about fix it, right? Sometimes it's very rarely, I think, are conflicts easy, cut and dry. Oh, we can just talk about this and fix it, right? Very rarely does that happen. A lot of times our interpersonal conflicts, especially with people that we love in our families, our romantic partners, our good friends, are very complex, and so we have to learn on how to manage them rather than just how do I fix this, right? So what this chapter and I am asking you to do is kind of rewire your brain into, instead of figuring out how to solve the problem, let's manage this problem. Let's figure out how we can use our communication to work through the problem, instead of just trying to leap and jump to the goal, right? Which is to make everybody happy or to achieve what I want out of this conflict. So the first step is to define your needs. What do you want? What do you need? A lot of times we don't take the time to share what we want and what we need openly, and sometimes we don't also think about what we want and need to ourselves, right? We don't take that time to sit down and think, what is it that I want out of this relationship? What is it that I need out of this situation? And so because of that, and as we've talked about in chapter 8, we're usually emotional at that time, so we're not thinking very clearly. And so because of that, we end up walking into the conflict with, I don't even know what I want out of this. Like, I'm not even sure, right, of what I think I want is what I want. And so it's important to define for yourself at first, what is it that I see happening, in the best case scenario in my mind, what should happen. And so you make sure you define what you need. The next thing is to share it. So to let the other person know, because people are not mind readers. They don't know what you need and what you want. So you have to be able to do that. Use I language when you are sharing your needs. We talked about I language in a lot of other chapters. We talked about it in chapter 8 when we talked about sharing emotions. We talked about it in chapter 4 when we talked about perception checking. So it is so important to master that I language and take responsibility for your perceptions, your emotions, and your needs here. Listen to the other person's needs. So hopefully you have encouraged them to also define and share their needs. And so as they listen to you, you also should try to take the chance to listen to them. And because of that, you can then put your heads together and generate, okay, I have heard what you need. You've heard what I need. Let's generate possible solutions based off those needs. And that's key. What a lot of people tend to do in conflict is that, if I know I'm going to talk to this person on this day, I walk into the conflict ready with what I need, what I want, and what I think should happen, right? My solution. And so that's important. As we say here, you should know what you want. You should be able to share what you want, but you can't be locked in to just one solution, right? That's why you let the other person share their needs as well. And then you both use your needs and your desires to generate solutions, and keyword here is solutions, so multiple, right, not just one, that you then can go on to evaluate. You can see that in the red. Evaluate all the solutions that you come up with. And so it's so important that neither person in the situation walks in already expecting a particular solution or expecting it to go a certain way, because like I said, you don't know what the other person's needs are. That person hasn't really heard your needs yet. And so once those conversation pieces come out, then you are able to generate more realistic possible solutions, evaluate those solutions, so you figure out, does this make sense? Does that make sense? Out of our list of 3 solutions, now we can compare and contrast them and see the pros and cons. Once you evaluate, you choose the solution and you implement it. So you say, okay, so I've decided that to resolve my need for you to spend more time with me, we are going to have date nights on Fridays. You've agreed to that. And then I also will make sure that when you are at work, to not text or call you a lot. And that's kind of our solution for now. So we implement it, right? And that's follow up to my example in previous slides. The key thing here is also to follow up. A lot of people implement, so they pick a solution, right? They get to that pink that second to last step, and then they never follow up. And that's so important to check back in with that person and be like, hey, so we decided to resolve our conflict this way. Like, do you like how this is playing out? Do you like how it's working? Because you might have brainstormed and evaluated your solution, but maybe it didn't, work out or play out in the real world as you imagined it would. And so it's so good to check in with that other person and say, hey, I know we've been fighting, and I know that we decided to do date night on Fridays. Is that enough for you? Are you good with that? Like, is this a solution that's working for us? And if not, start the process over again, and that's why conflicts are messy, relationships are messy, and your needs can change as well over time. And so maybe that solution worked for you at that time, in that here and now, and it's important to follow up in 2 or 3 months and be like, I wanted that 2 or 3 months ago. Now I'm finding out that's not what I want. And so it's really good to communicate about that kind of stuff. All right. So with that being said, let's wrap up what we learned today. We learned about what conflict is. We discussed its very complex definition. We talked about how perception is involved between 2 interdependent parties, meaning parties that need one another for something, in achieving their goals, in sharing resources. And ultimately, what we learned is that there are conflict styles that we engage in. There are conflict styles that we tend to go to more, but that we should practice being able to engage in all of those conflict styles in order to be competent, effective, and appropriate communicators in any given situation. We also learned how to look at whether or not our conflict styles match with other people. So we looked at both complementary and symmetrical conflict styles. So it's good to ask ourselves, with my romantic partner, does my conflict style complement theirs, or is it symmetrical to theirs? So is it different but complementary, or symmetrical, meaning the same as them? As a result, do we escalate into spirals, or do we de-escalate too much? And so that was kind of our follow-up to learning our styles. And then we jumped into toxic conflict, and we learned about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and why they're important to monitor and make sure that we avoid them when we can, especially contempt, because that is the number 1 predictor of an end of a relationship. And finally, we learned about the different strategies and skills needed to effectively manage conflict, meaning not always fix something or find an immediate solution, but to manage a conflict in its full entire process. And so we learned those different skills here today. I hope that this was helpful in teasing out a lot of the nuances of this chapter. But I know that this chapter is so fun to read because you really learn a lot about yourself and other people that you have conflicts with. So with that being said, I am going to go ahead and throw it up for some questions. Let me see who I have here. Christopher has asked, is it best to avoid conflict rituals? If so, how would you achieve that? Christopher, it's not best to avoid conflict rituals. I would say that, as I said in the lecture, all people who are in relationships, close relationships with other people, develop conflict rituals. It makes sense. If you have lived with your sibling, you have a sibling that you've lived with for your entire life, Christopher, and you have conflict with them, it's natural that you two will develop a conflict ritual. The only time it's bad or undesirable is when it's the only way you know how to fix a conflict. Conflict rituals aren't good or bad. It just means that, like, hey, like, this is the way we, as a couple, as a unit, as friends, as whatever, approach a conflict, and it's predictable and it helps, right? People understand the flow of the conflict, and it keeps people a little bit more comfortable in relationships, actually, because I know if a conflict ever comes up, oh, this is how me and Christopher handle it. The only time it's bad, Christopher, is when it's the only way you know how to do it. So let's say a new situation comes up where our conflict ritual just doesn't really make sense for that situation or doesn't match. We can't keep trying to use the same conflict styles all the time in that ritual if a new situation pops up. One key example is a romantic couple might have a conflict ritual where they fight in a very similar pattern, throughout their relationship, and then let's say they have kids. And that changes the game a lot, as you can see. And so your conflict ritual might have to change because now you have these new factors in your life has changed, everything has changed, your situation has changed. And so in that situation, you should make sure to edit and change your conflict rituals because now you have kids in the mix, right? Maybe before you were comfortable with fighting all the time, and now that you have kids, you can't be fighting in front of your kids. So of course your conflict ritual has to change. So Christopher, it's all about editing, updating, changing your conflict ritual as you develop a relationship with that person. And again, the conflict ritual isn't bad. It gives you a lot of comfort. It gives you knowledge knowing this is how me and that other person deal with conflict. It's only bad when it's the only way you deal with conflict, right? That you're not willing to learn other styles and other ways of doing it. Savannah has asked, why do us humans tend to compromise instead of actually talking about the problem? Savannah, it's because we get a lot of satisfaction from compromise. If I ask you, Savannah, to give up something for me, I feel real great about that. And likewise, if you ask me in compromise to give up something for you, because that's what compromise is, right? Savannah, I give up something, you give up something. It just makes us feel like, yeah, we fixed the problem. We did it. Go us. And so we get this kind of feeling or this illusion that we satisfied one another, that we fixed the problem, but in reality we didn't, right? Savannah, one example is I have a pair of friends. They just got married, and they were deciding on where to go for their honeymoon. And so one of them wanted to go to Italy. One of them wanted to go to England, so they compromised and went to France. So they both gave up what they wanted and then kind of did this middle ground thing. And ultimately, neither of them were happy. They didn't want to go to France. Neither of them wanted to go to France. But at the time when they made that decision, Savannah, they felt really good about it. They felt like, yeah, we accomplished something. We found a solution. And so it's us humans, conflict makes us really uncomfortable. And so we like compromise because it makes us feel like we fixed everything. And like I said, and the title of the chapter says, it's not about fixing conflict, right? It's about managing conflict. And that's much messier and more difficult to deal with than finding a quick fix solution. So Savannah, that's why we love compromise so much. We see it as this wonderful sacrifice that I'm going to make for you and you're going to make for me, and we're going to move forward, and yay, we fixed our problem. But in reality, you've just both given up something, and neither of you have actually come up with a viable solution for your conflict to begin with. But it's an illusion, right? It makes us kind of feel like we fixed it. Hope that answers your question, Savannah. And Christopher, I also hope I answered your question. Let me know if I did not. Guillermo, are certain conflict styles more common in high context versus low context ones? Yes, Guillermo, I talked about this. So in high context cultures, they really value that nonverbal, whereas low context are more on the linguistic verbal side of conflict. And so it would make sense that accommodation and avoidance tend to be more high context, and in low context cultures we tend to get more competition, and we get more compromise as well in low context cultures, because both of those styles require a lot of verbal interaction, and they don't care too much about saving face. Whereas in accommodation and avoidance, high context cultures tend to also be collectivist, where they want to save face, right? They want to do what's best for the group. So of course they will accommodate or avoid where they can. Sydney, how do you avoid serial arguments from continuing to happen? That is a good question, Sydney. Managing conflict is my answer. I know it's not the sexy, wonderful answer you wanted, Sydney, but it's really about managing conflict. Let me tell you why. When you are having serial or just repeated, consistent fights with someone, which I think is what you're asking. If that's not what you're asking, clarify for me. But I'm assuming when you mean serial arguments, you're meaning that you keep fighting about the same thing, right? So if you're consistently fighting about the same thing or multiple things or related things and you're just fighting all the time, it's really usually because you never actually resolve the conflict to begin with. You might be doing what I just talked about with Savannah, where you are engaging in compromise with the other person. So you give up something, they give up something. So you walk away feeling like, yes, we fixed it, but you didn't. And so what the biggest thing I want you to take away from this is the last couple steps that we looked at when we looked at conflict management, which is, do you do all of these every single time you fight? Because if you do, then most of the time you won't be fighting about the same thing serially over and over and over again, because you will be just practicing following up on your solutions and editing them and fixing them and growing and developing your relationship with that person. But if you feel like I'm always fighting with this person about the same exact thing all the time, just in different ways, it's usually because you never took the time to define your needs, or they didn't. And most likely, both of you did not share your needs with the other person openly, directly, using I language, and you did not base your solutions off each other's needs. Like I said when I was talking about this slide, what we tend to do is we walk into the conflict knowing, especially if it's one that's happened before, we're like, I already know what's going to happen. I know what solution I want. This is what I want. Right? And we don't take the time to go through these steps and ask that other person, what do you want? Okay, good. Now here's what I want. And now that we've both put out what we want, what our needs are, let's use the needs as the foundation for our solution rather than already coming into the interaction with a solution. And so, Sydney, a lot of serial arguments happen because the argument actually was never managed appropriately. The conflict wasn't managed appropriately, and you feel like you fixed it, and then it just kind of happens again. So it just seems like a new conflict every time, but really it's just the same conflict that you've been having, that it just isn't dying. The conflict isn't dying because you haven't been managing it. And so, Sydney, it's so important that I know that this list seems very like blah, like no duh, but people don't do this. And so because people don't do all of these steps, they walk away feeling like, yeah, we resolved our conflict. And then guess what? 2, 3, 4 months, a year later, you're fighting about the same thing again because you didn't implement a solution that was based off each other's needs, and you didn't follow up about the solution either. Most of the time, I would say, Sydney, that's what it is, okay? Make sure that I answered your question correctly, Sydney. I think that's what you meant by serial arguments. Let me know. Rosie has asked, how do you handle conflict management with a person who is known being difficult, victimizing themselves? Rosie, I didn't see you initially today. Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. You came in a little halfway through the lecture, so I didn't even see your name pop up. Hi, Rosie. What's up? I didn't say hi to you. I didn't include you in my other examples. Because I know you was here, but I'm glad you're here. When the other person is being difficult and victimizing themselves, one of the things you need to know is that there's nothing you can do about that. We are responsible for ourselves. We can only control what we do. We can't control what other people do. And so if they are being difficult, if they are victimizing themselves, you can communicate your needs and say, hey, I really need you to just share with me what you want right now. I really need you to not express so much about, why you feel you've been wronged. I need to hear what I can do to make it right. What are your needs? Say something to that extent. And if they don't want to do it, Rosie, you get out of there. You excuse yourself from the conversation because it's not going to be worth your time. And I know that's really difficult, especially with people that we care about. We want to be in the conflict with them. I want to stay here. I want to fix it, right? But just say like, hey, like when you're ready to talk about that, when you're ready to define your needs and share them with me, like I'm here. I want to listen to that. But I cannot be in a conversation where, usually when someone victimizes themselves, they make you feel bad for, their victimization, or they blame other things. Redirect them. Don't say, stop victimizing yourself. Say things like, I just need you to tell me what I need to do to make it right, rather than all the things that are wrong. Because usually people who play the victim, Rosie, say, well, this is what happened, and this is why this is wrong, and this is why this isn't my fault, and this is why I'm the victim, me. And so you force them into I language, taking responsibility for how they feel, and clearly expressing how they, what do you want, right? So don't tell me about what's wrong. Tell me about what you want to do to make it right. And so Rosie pushed them towards that. And if they don't do that, then you have every right to exit that conversation. And again, I know that's really hard, but I think we need to practice doing that, because the longer you stay in that conversation of unproductive conflict, the worse the conflict actually gets, because it's not being managed. Kind of think of it as a cut. If it gets infected and you don't manage it, it'll just grow, right? And it'll get far worse, Rosie. So you need to be able to tell the person, well, okay, if, I just really feel like you're not expressing to me what you need. And I just don't feel like this conversation is going in a productive way yet. So please kind of think about what you need. Be ready to share them with me. I'll be ready to listen, but I can't continue to be in this conversation right now. Kind of communicate to them like, hey, I still care about you. I still want to be in this relationship with you. I just kind of need to back off out of this conflict, because I don't feel like, I'm hearing what I need to hear from you. And so be honest like that, Rosie. And I know that's really hard. It's easier said than done, but we have to be able to step out of conversations that are not helpful to us, because sometimes we're just making the conflict worse by, extending conversations that aren't helpful. Vanessa, in regards to complementary symmetrical conflicts, are these ones recognized in the relationship? Does it make it easier to tackle issues? Yes, Vanessa. So that's why it's good to know, does my boyfriend or girlfriend complement my conflict style? Are they the same as my conflict style? And you might actually have both, right? Depending on context. So when it comes to the kids, you might have symmetrical conflict style, but as a couple, when you're fighting about each other, you might have complementary conflict style. So it's good to recognize it so that you recognize your ritual and you recognize what you're doing well and not doing well. So like I said earlier with Christopher's question, you can edit and change your ritual and your styles as necessary with one another, because it's not just my style that I should be worried about, it's the other person's style as well, right? So when we're studying complementary and symmetrical conflict, Vanessa, the reason we're studying it is to try to help us understand in the relationship, what are we doing regularly in our conflict styles, and is that good or bad? Is it helpful or not? And yes, you're right, it does make it easier to tackle issues, because I know exactly how you will react, Vanessa, and you know how I will react, and you'll understand a little bit more about my conflict styles, and so it kind of helps ease people into conflict and manage it a little bit much more easily. And we also like predictability, right, Vanessa? So I like knowing that my best friend, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, whatever, will react a certain way in a conflict, and they know that I will react a certain way in a conflict, and it just makes the management of the conflict a little bit easier when we both can predict what the other person will do. All right, so I think that's all my questions today. Thank you so much for coming in. This is our second to last lecture, so lots of fun stuff to come in the later days. And so make sure that if you will not be there for my last lecture, that you've achieved all of the requirements for attending live lectures as I've talked about, because this I believe it's Wednesday, don't quote me on that, but later this week I am lecturing on chapter 12. That'll be our last lecture. If you have not achieved all of your listening stuff, your lecture stuff, make sure to do that. Start on your summative paper. Call me if you need any help. So set up a phone call appointment. I can help you through the summative paper,